light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Having recorded over 450 episodes at this point, one would think that there is nothing more to be said, but of course, as life continues to unfold, there is always more to be said, because every experience is new and different, because one comes to it new and different with memories that one didn't have the last time one encountered this particular thing. Everything that has come before bears upon this present moment. And if the present moment is one of loss, it still has within it, I believe, the ability to be transformed into a gain. That everything that has gone before has given me a different way of looking at this experience of loss than I ever had before. I don't know that there's ever a recipe for how to deal with current moments of frustration or difficulty, because the new moment has awareness and understandings that bear on it that no previous moment ever had. And it is important that I bring my full self to it, and that I be willing to engage with it, and that I not run away from it as simply, I can't deal with this. And because the moment I say it's something I can't deal with, I have basically stopped my growth at that point, because life presents those sorts of things that I need to learn from and learn to deal with, and the things that I need to overcome. And until I overcome them, they overcome me. And that is also a sort of loss, that I lose my confidence in my ability to cope, and I lose my confidence in my ability to do what needs to be done if I encounter a time where there has been a setback or a problem or a challenge and I have not overcome it. And it's kind of like that's where everything stops. Coping with loss requires me to look it in the face, and kind of like the saying, it's not so important how many times one falls as it is how many times one gets up. I don't know who said that the very first time. It's been an idea that's been with humanity for a long time, the idea that we don't give up and that we keep going, and that we push through until we find a way to make things work. And that the reason we ultimately overcame an obstacle in many cases is simply because we didn't give up. In some cases, there is a frustration and a difficulty to it, and I don't know what to do, and I don't have an answer. And people have sometimes described me as wise, and I don't know that I look in the mirror and think of myself as a wise person. But perhaps the more experiences I have and the more time I've spent thinking about things, the more I've come to an understanding of them. And yet, no amount of understanding I've amassed has been enough to keep difficulties from happening. No matter how many difficulties I've overcome, there are still difficulties in the future. And the only way I get past them, and the only way that the good stuff happens, is by refusing to give up when the bad stuff happens. And refusing to quit when the frustration happens. And no matter how many times I have a false start to one of these television shows because I try to think of something intelligent to say, and it's like my brain locks up, and I, like an old computer where, in which when one tried to open too many programs on the computer all at once, the whole computer would freeze, and you'd have to wait for 5 or 10 minutes or more sometimes, waiting for the computer to move, because it had so much data to process that it just totally froze because it became overwhelmed with all the demands. Sometimes, well, especially as an autistic man, I frequently feel overwhelmed by the demands of life, and too many things saying, answer me, resolve me, do me, fix me. It's too much. And so in a lighthearted sort of way, I sometimes stop and close my eyes and wave my hands and say, okay, problems, please form a single line to the right and I will deal with you one at a time. Of course, problems don't line up in single file line like that and allow me to deal with them one at a time, but in shifting the focus and in shifting the control of the moment, it's not that I have to control the moment, it's not that I'm really in control of anything, but what I can control is my response. And so in that sense, I can't ignore the problems because they will always be there until they're resolved. And until I learn the lesson that they have to teach me, they won't go away, because there's a sense in which every problem and every loss and every challenge is like a guardian angel of questionable appearance that the divine has sent to me to deliver a message. And until I receive that message, the angel's mission is not accomplished, and it can't abandon its mission. It has to do its mission. And so I have to listen, and until I listen, it can't go away because it has to deliver the message. And so when I stop myself and say, what is it that you're trying to tell me? Because I don't like your interruption, I don't like what you're presenting me with, and maybe even that is part of it, to become more aware of where my preferences and my likes and dislikes are. That to recognize that this path I've been told to take and the approach I've been told to utilize isn't working. And the first thing I need to recognize is that it isn't working and that a new approach is needed. And that I have to do things differently than I did before, because the way I did it before isn't working anymore. It's looking in the mirror and embracing my own life experience and not censoring anything, but to recognize that my life experience is what it is and that it's asking certain things of me. And until I incorporate all of it, I can't figure out how to put the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together. I can't finish a jigsaw puzzle without using all the pieces that were included in the box that I received. All the pieces that the puzzle includes. Even if someone gave me a bag of jigsaw puzzle pieces and said, these all belong to one puzzle, it's your job to put them together without a picture. By comparing the colors and shapes of each piece, I think I would eventually find things that fit and begin to put it together, and only when I was done putting all the pieces together would I understand what the picture was. Sometimes experiencing a loss is the loss that I experience is not knowing what the picture is supposed to be, but having only the pieces and having to study the pieces long enough to figure out how they fit together. And only after I understand the relationships of each piece to each other piece can I begin to understand that the picture and the overall message, the summary that they're trying to tell me. As an autistic man, I'm more and more often telling people that generalities don't exist, and in fact generalities may be the mythology of neurotypical people to make sense within within conversations. They want to speak about generalities, but because they don't know the specific pieces. For the neurotypical person, being neurotypical, even though the majority of the population experience it, because autistic people are less than 2% of the human race, understanding, from the perspective of as being an autistic man, I think of the neurotypical people as the people with disabilities, because they have to go through life with everything slightly out of focus, because they're not seeing the details. And so to cope with this disability of not seeing the details, they create generalities so that they can talk about their struggles and their challenges. But the generalities don't give them the answers, the details do. The generalities give them ways of conversing and ways of looking for the details, but until they find the details and substitute the details for the generalities and set the mythology aside as a conversational tool that was useful for a while but cannot ultimately provide the answer, but provides a way to find pieces and to begin to organize pieces. The challenge that I often run into as an autistic man is where I encounter neurotypical people who want to promote the generality as a sort of mythology, that I'm supposed to subscribe to the generality, and I step forward and say, but the generality isn't true. It's a conversational reference. It's a tool, but it is not the goal or the destination. It is not the end product we're trying to achieve. It is simply a tool that may get us closer to what we are trying to achieve. So the first loss that we have to embrace is the loss of the generality and the embrace of the specific, of the precise, of the actual. That as long as I use a category or a generality to try to relate to the person in front of me, nothing will make any sense, because what I need to recognize, what I need to ask, to begin with a question and say, this is the generality. What has been your actual experience? There are probably things in your actual experience that have a certain commonality with the generality, but they also have a distinction from the generality. That one could say, I am like the generality in this way, but I am different from the generality in that way. And the reason that I have both similarities and differences is because I'm an individual. And yet I'm not a narcissistic individual who expects the entire universe to orient around me. I'm a relational individual. I am, in the healthiest sense, I demonstrate relational individuality because I bring something totally unique and specific and precise to this relationship or interaction. But it has to be an interaction, because as an individual I cannot survive on my own. There has to be a symbiotic relationship where I give whatever I can to the relationships around me to sustain them, and they give what I need in return, so that each of us gets our needs met and we each have the ability to survive by being together in the midst of it. By encountering the loss together, we begin to figure out how you have part of the answer and I have part of the answer, and when we put the two together, the loss is not so much a termination point beyond which we cannot progress, but it is rather a transition point that guides us to move in a slightly different way, in a slightly different direction. That where we thought this is where we were headed, in actuality we're headed over here, and it's not that much different from where we're standing. But once we go 2 or 3 or 4 miles down the road, the further we go down the road, the further we are from where the other path would have led us, and the difference can be huge. And then to stop and think that the only reason we managed to get on we managed to shift and get onto the correct path was because of the loss we experienced at a particular juncture. At that juncture, though, which may be where some of us are today in this moment as you're watching the show, sometimes all you know is that it hurts, and you don't know what to do, and you don't know where to go, and the sadness won't go away. And sometimes it's about sitting with the sadness until you can begin to hear its voice, and begin to hear whatever funeral song or dirge it's singing, and to begin to notice what it is that makes that sadness what it is. What is the specific loss that makes it what it is? Is it just the fact that a loved one has died, or is it the things that loved one provided to one's life, one of which may be inspiration and wisdom and guidance? How are we going to proceed without the inspiration and wisdom and guidance of the person whom we have lost? And in that sense, trying to put together our memories and to integrate our memories with our imagination, and to say, if this person were still here, what would she do? What would he do? What would they tell me to do in this situation? And how am I different from that person in this way so that I need to make an adaptation? And I can't, even if I can imagine what this loved one whom I've lost would do in this situation, or, well, a very difficult situation in my life at the moment, someone who has given me guidance and wisdom so many times in the past, who is now developing Alzheimer's and cannot remember the memories and the times we shared and the challenges that we resolved together. And trying to think of what that person would have recommended at a time in the past that they cannot recommend to me now. And so there's this kind of loss, but it's a very specific kind of loss that I have to think of. What would this person, the person whom I knew 10 years ago, what would they recommend in this situation? Because the person whom they have become due to the onset of Alzheimer's cannot resolve the challenges that formerly were manageable. And if they cannot carry the memories forward into their current challenges, is it helpful for me to carry the memories for them? Or is it more that I need to carry the memories for myself and for everyone else who could learn from their previous example? That when other people meet this loved one who is now developing Alzheimer's and see nothing more than a person with Alzheimer's, I can tell the stories of what this person accomplished, what they knew, what they were able to contribute to life, and by using those memories and integrating those with the imaginations of myself and the other people, to learn, to be able to invent new ways of solving problems based on the previous example of that person who can no longer give the example that they once did. It's a complex, multifaceted experience of loss that robs the Alzheimer's of its negative effects. That because this person is more than just their current embodiment, because this person is a dynamics and understandings and memories that I carry and that other people who knew this person carry, that there is a sense in which they have become more than a single entity. They are a physical entity that is experiencing Alzheimer's, but they are a spiritual entity in the memories of everyone who knew them, that if we all put our heads together and combine all the memories of how this person dealt with challenges in the past, we can, through our imaginations, come up with a solution that the loved one never actually did, but that may be particularly empowering and inspiring to us where we are now. So in a sense, this loved one is becoming more than they ever were within our imaginations by allowing this person a spiritual manifestation within our conversation that they cannot have physically. We can create a solution to a problem that they didn't in fact ever solve. And in that way rob Alzheimer's and rob the problem and rob the challenge of its victory, and instead claim the victory for ourselves and move ourselves and humanity further forward by the understandings that can be extrapolated from our combined ingenuity, not just the ingenuity of myself and what I remember, but the ingenuity that can come from everyone who remembers this loved one. It reminds me, and I've never been through this myself, and I've often invited Jewish people to be guests on my show, but so far, for whatever reason, no one has ever accepted, and that's neither here nor there, but there is a practice of mourning within the Jewish faith that I believe is calling sitting Shiva, where it's all the people who remember that person coming together and sitting together and sharing the stories and processing their grief in a communal sort of way. And by putting all this together, being able to process grief as a community that may be insurmountable on an individual level. Applying that basic dynamic to other challenges, it invites the possibility of sitting Shiva, or whatever would be a better terminology for it, in dealing with any particular problem. That as we talk about how this problem affects each of us, and what is it that makes this problem so important to solve, and why can't we just ignore the problem and go on living? Well, we can't because of this particular impact, or because it takes away this particular resource. And as we have this conversation and put our thoughts together, essentially brainstorming together, but brainstorming together around an event that has an emotional context, as well as an intellectual context, as well as a historical context. In a sense, it's what we've experienced, but it's also how we are writing our present and future in new ways, by incorporating memories and collective imagination, not just my imagination, but yours and everyone else's imagination also. That together our combined imaginations can create things that no individual imagination could create, because one person has one piece of the puzzle and another has another piece. And when we begin to put our pieces together, the losses are not just trivial historical events or things that make us angry or setbacks, but they become turning points and points of transformation and points of becoming more than we have ever been and more than our loved one ever was. And in that sense, the further humanity goes through time, the more we have to work with, but only to the extent that we're able to remember it. And that's why it becomes so important to share our stories and to ask the questions of, how does it affect you? I've heard other stories, I've heard generalizations, I've heard speculations. How did it affect you? What is your story? How did you deal with having a broken heart when you were a teenager? How did you deal with the first time someone in your immediate family died? How did you deal with being rejected by your entire family because you were gay, or because you were lesbian, or because you're intersex or transgender, or because how did you deal with being rejected by your church because you couldn't quite agree with a particular point of doctrine that the church insisted was the only right answer to a question? Coping with loss, I guess above all else, is about acknowledging and accepting the grief and the tears and the sadness, but simultaneously holding to the understanding that the tears and the sadness are not where the story ends, and that the death of a loved one is not where the story ends, because even though that person's physical body is gone, the memories and their contributions to life and the ways that they left the world a better place are still here and are still evolving and still developing. And people who come to a community and they buy a house and move into it, and often don't give much thought to who built the house, and before the house was built, who cleared the land if it used to be a forest 100 years ago, and who was the city street worker who laid the sewer pipes, and or the utility worker who ran the power lines, or the one who delivered coal to heat the home before electric heat of any sort was even available. All of these unnamed and unknown people that came before created the foundation upon which the current experience happens. There's no current experience that exists without a historical, without a temporal context. It didn't just happen out of nothing. One of the ways that I rephrase it frequently is that there is no such thing as an uncaused effect. Trying to learn what the cause was, or how many causes there were, or what the previous story was and learn the rest of the story so enriches the current moment, because it gives us so much more material with which to build something even better and more beautiful in the future. So that if there is a setback, if there is a loss, we will come to it with greater wisdom than anyone before us came to it. If you're experiencing loss, please don't give up, and understand that the experience of loss is not the end of the story. There is more story to write, and it comes from, and that writing involves accepting the present, accepting the emotions, processing the emotions, but understanding that the loss and the pain and the grief and the tears are not where the story ends. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that some of the thoughts I've shared in the last half hour have been helpful to you.